Colômbia pegou melhor, uma disputa acirrada, e agora eu não presumo o departamento de saúde, Colômbia do Verso de Jó. O professor Tempestade já é conhecido de óbvio, que já publicou em revistas brasileiras, tanto a FDCS como a DAP já publicaram o trabalho dele. Ele tem um trabalho bastante conhecido, sobretudo sobre o desenvolvimento recente do capitalismo no pós-socialismo. Ele vai fazer uma exposição, espera as questões ao final. Também já aviso de antemão que estará aqui por mais 2 dias, se não houver tempo para discussão, ele está à disposição e a pessoa deve se sentir à vontade para procurar as observações críticas que quer ser. Muito obrigada. Aí vai falar já do Confere ncia.
See how this microphone has a bad echo. Is that good? I hear it. I'm very honored to have been asked to speak to you this morning. First, I want to extend my thanks to Elisa Reis for this invitation. It's very nice for me to see old friends here in Brazil and have this opportunity to make new words. I really look forward over the next few days to your criticisms and suggestions of my remarks this morning, and to a chance for me to learn more about the work that you're doing. Now, I take my invitation not only as a personal that are taking place in the post-socialist societies of Eastern Europe. And so it's on behalf not only of myself, but also on behalf of my East European colleagues and all of us in the field of the comparative study of post-socialism, that I thank you for this opportunity to present some of our findings of these experiences with democratization and economic reform, these very important transformations of politics and property. Now, my talk this morning opens with a debate which has been taking place in Eastern Europe since 1989. So it's a debate that's gone on already now for 7, almost 8 years. And there are 2 key positions in this debate. The debate is, first, what is the best way to restructure the economies, and what is the best way to restructure the enterprises in the economies of Eastern Europe? Closer to the mic. Be almost in my mouth. Okay, so the debate is, what is the best way to restructure the economies and the enterprises of Eastern Europe? And there are 2 positions in that debate. The first position is the neoliberal position. And that is that the best way to restructure these economies is to use a strong market. In this neoliberal position, markets are not only the goal, they can also be the means. The best way to restructure these economies and these enterprises is to use strong markets. Now, after about 3 years, that is starting around 1992, there became a second position in this debate, and we should call it a neo-statist position. It's a position that was very much influenced by a very particular reading of the economies of East Asia, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and the like. And this neo-statist position, as you can already grasp from my label of it, argued that the neoliberals were wrong. They confused goals and means. That the best way to restructure these economies is that you need strong states. In the absence of strong states, it would be impossible to get strong markets. So there's 2 very clear positions. The neoliberal position that says you need strong markets. And a neo-statist position that says you need strong states. Now, I think my limited understanding of Brazilian political economy suggests to me that this is not the first time that you've encountered these dichotomous positions. Now, the problem, though, in Eastern Europe is, remember, what the neoliberals are saying, the best way to restructure is you need strong states, strong markets. The neo-statists say the best way to restructure is you need strong states. The problem with Eastern Europe is that this is a part of the world which, for decades, if not for centuries, precisely lacks both strong markets and strong states. So these two non-existing starting points remind me of a joke in which an Irishman in the far, far countryside is asked, what's the best way to get to Dublin? Thinks for a minute and he says, the best way to get to Dublin, don't start from here. Now, our Irishman's irony would not be lost on East Europeans, because they all know that the best ways to get to capitalism would be to start from somewhere else. But of course, they don't have that luxury. They don't have the luxury of following the plans of the designer capitalists, whether they be the neoliberals who tell them to start from someplace that they are not, or the neo-statists who say you need strong states, but they don't have strong states. They don't have this luxury to start from somewhere else. They have to start from where they are. And so the starting point of my talk this morning is to reformulate the question. And instead of asking, what's the best way to get to capitalism, or the best way to restructure these economies, the best way to restructure these firms, I ask another one. How do we start from here? With what resources might East Europeans embark on the difficult and long journey of restructuring their economies? What resources do they have? Now, if it is the case that these economies, these societies, lack both strong markets and strong states, it is also the case that they do have an important resource, and that is that they have strong networks. For decades under state socialism, firms and families develop strong networks on the part of managers, networks with ties to other enterprise managers in order to get the job done, to meet the planned target. For families, networks of ties to other friends and extended kinship and fictive kinship networks that allow them to get the job done, to provide for their families. And so these are economies, societies, in which people have a great deal of experience and knowledge in the use and the promotion and the development and the emergence of strong associative ties. And so with my colleague Laszlo Bruce, the Hungarian political sociologist, we asked the question, instead of restructuring via markets or via the state, might it be possible to think about these societies as reorganizing by restructuring networks? By this term, restructuring networks, we have in mind two processes. The first is that the unit to be restructured would not be the isolated enterprise. The standard idea in the big debate about privatization that almost all the different perspectives assume is that the unit that must be restructured is the individual enterprise. So we ask a different question. What if policymakers and the actual economic actors involved were restructuring not enterprises, but networks of enterprises? What if that were the unit to be restructured? And secondly, what if the agency of restructuring the mode of restructuring, the institutions of restructuring, were neither those of the isolated, fragmented actors of markets, nor those of the command, authoritative, hierarchical structures of states, but were themselves networks, associations. What if these were the units to be restructured and they were the institutions of restructuring? So we call that restructuring networks. And we further label the institutions which are very good at this restructuring deliberative associations. I'll talk more about that as my talk goes on, but to indicate to you now, by the term deliberative associations, we have in mind two aspects. One is the aspect of associative ties, or connected, that they have social ties to each other. And the other is that aspect of a deliberative discourse. So it's both networks and narratives. You might say both ties and talk. Both the binding ties, the ties that bind, that make possible binding agreements. And when these associative ties come together in deliberative forums, we have deliberative associations. Now, my first part of my talk this morning now will be to move to the economic field and make a comparison of Hungary and the Czech Republic in the period between roughly 1989 and last year. And that comparison is going to focus on economic policy. The second part of the talk, after the first describes some important differences in economic policy in Hungary and the Czech Republic, the second part of the talk is going to move to the political field, because it's in the analysis of political institutions in politics that I will explain the differences between the Czech and the Hungarian cases. And it's that second part which is actually the subject of the paper which I brought with me, and which is available and I think will be translated into Portuguese and published in the Journal of ANPOCS. That's called Enabling Constraints. But before getting you to the explanation, it's important that you understand the differences that I'm trying to explain. So we're going to look first at Hungary and the Czech Republic. And the question I'm asking is, to what extent do policymakers recognize the potential for these restructuring networks? To what extent, whether, and how policymakers in Hungary recognize the network properties of assets? To what extent they recognize the network properties of liabilities? By network properties, I'm deliberately exploiting the double meaning of property. Property as a holding, a possession, property. And the other notion of property as in characteristic. And when I talk about network properties, I refer to the interdependence of assets, the network properties. That the true sort of unit of property is not the firm or the individual, it's the interdependent ties that they have in it. So my comparison of the cases will be to look at how do Hungary and the Czech Republic differ? Do politicians recognize these network properties, or do they fail to recognize them? And with what consequences? How am I doing? Okay. So let's turn first to Hungary. First to Hungary, and we'll look first at property. Now it turns out that the Hungarian case is one in which the official policy of the privatization agency, called the State Property Agency, the SPA, is to refuse to recognize interdependent assets. The entire official ideology and the organizational practice of the agency responsible for privatization is to deny these network properties and to privatize on a strictly case-by-case basis. We will take this firm and privatize it, we'll take that firm and privatize it, we'll take this firm and privatize it, and the like. Okay? So if, as I did, I went to the office of the State Property Agency and I knocked on the door of the transaction officer responsible for privatizing a wire factory, a company that makes wire. It takes metal strips, strands it together. So I talk with her, and then when I leave her office, I go upstream, so to speak. I go down the hall, just a couple doors down the hall, and I knock on the door of the transaction officer who's responsible for privatizing the metallurgy company, the iron company that produces the raw material that goes into making the cable. And that transaction officer is completely ignorant of anything that's being done by the officer of the State Property Agency just 3 doors down. Or if I walk a little bit farther down the hall, sort of downstream, so to speak, and talk to the transaction officer who's responsible for privatizing the electrical machine company, that's the downstream customer of the wire factory, they also are completely ignorant, and deliberately so, because it's the official policy of the agency to privatize only on a case-by-case basis. They have nothing to do with each other. Now, we might think that's the end of the story, but it turns out, of course, that there are other actors involved in property transformation in Hungary, other actors, that is, actors other than the state agencies. There are the enterprises themselves and the managers who run them. And in Hungary, it turns out that even though the state disregarded the network properties of assets, although the state was acting as if property wasn't interdependent, actors in enterprises recognized that they had these interdependent assets, and they were engaged in aspects and practices of recombinant, I call it property transformation, which began regrouping assets according to their interdependence. And how do we know this is the case? First, on the basis of my field work over this period in a good number of Hungarian enterprises, and also on the basis of collection, very systematic collection, of who owns the top 200 Hungarian firms and the top 25 banks. So my research assistants and I went to the courts of registry, which large Hungarian companies and banks must have in their corporate files precise data on who owns the company. We can know exactly who are all the owners of the company as of the most recent shareholders meeting. So we limit our analysis to the top 20 owners of each of the firms, and then we see, well, who owns these companies? The most straightforward answer to the question, who owns the top 200 companies and banks in Hungary, is other top 200 companies and banks in Hungary. That is, the companies are owning each other. If you turn on this overhead, this is a network diagram of one of the relative discrete networks that my research assistants and I identified in the Hungarian economy. Ties here are ownership links marking the interdependence of assets among very large enterprises and banks. If you can put the second slide on, this is just an example of another network. Please, the second. Just the other way. Very good. So you can see very dense and extensive cross-ownership ties among these enterprises. I might say I have a new paper on this aspect. It's called post-socialist portfolios, and it identifies the 8 major business groups of the Hungarian economy. Identifies not only what the groups are, but the principles, and it turns out the very interesting different principles upon which they come together as groups. And I've brought copies of that, and I'm happy to share it. Okay, we can turn this off now. And don't put on the next one, just kill the light. Please, thanks. Okay, good. Okay, now we might ask, well, what about these networks? And my argument is that these are extremely interesting possibilities for risk sharing, for risk spreading. These are ways that firms make ties to each other, and in this difficult period of the transformation, regroup their assets. They recombine their assets. And the argument that I make here in more elaborated form elsewhere is that these recombinant practices might make possible restructuring. The best way to think about this is that these are networks of survival. They are means of coping in this difficult period. But we shouldn't be too strong about making a dichotomy between survival and innovation. Since in these periods of extreme uncertainty, firms may need to survive in order to innovate. The standard neoliberal line is firms must innovate in order to survive. Okay? But it could be that these risk-spreading networks make possible survival, which makes possible further innovation. But it's also possible that these institutions for risk spreading, which might make possible risk taking, because without institutions of risk sharing, firms are not likely to want to take risks. In addition to making possible risk taking, they also might make possible risk shedding. That the networks collectively are shedding, because they have these mechanisms of coordination, their risk onto the state and hence onto the citizen. And that, it turns out to be the case in Hungary. Why? Because now I'll turn not only from the network properties of assets to the state's policies regarding, or disregarding, as it turns out, the network properties of liabilities. And it's the combination of these two that yield such disastrous consequences for the Hungarian economy. Because the state's policies toward the liabilities of firms, think especially of the debts that firms owe to other firms and the debts that they owe to banks, disregarded these network properties. I need to tell you a brief story to make this clear. At the end of 1991, the Hungarian government passed a set of legislation that took effect in January of 1992. The first change was to change the accounting practices for Hungarian firms. From January 1st, 1992, every major Hungarian firm that was registered as a corporation would be required to use standard Western accounting practices. The second change was that the bankruptcy law was changed, brought into correspondence with very strict Western-style bankruptcy practices. In fact, if anything, it was even more draconian than Western bankruptcy law because it contained a provision in which the manager of a firm whose accountant came to him or her and said, the firm is in the red, if that manager did not take the firm into bankruptcy, file, the American parlance would say, file for Chapter 11, file for bankruptcy, the manager of the firm could be criminally liable. Very harsh bankruptcy. And the third change, which also took place in January 1st, 1992, was a change in the banking law.